WBNE.
Hello and welcome to episode 87, all about The Hobbit, Chapter 1, An Unexpected Party, being the 87th part of That's What I'm Tolkien About. Hello, my name is Mary Clay. If that's too complicated for you, just call me MC. And today I'm joined by Dr. Corey Olson, the Tolkien professor, I should say, himself. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I guess it's been a while since I've acknowledged the fact that, yes, on my podcast, I do say Tolkien, but that's just for the sake of the pun. I understand it's Tolkien.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, it's kind of like probably actually somewhere in the middle. Like it's not exactly keen exactly, but it's fine. It's fine. Everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And today we are starting, listeners, this is so exciting. We are at last starting The Hobbit, which
that's right.
I should have started with in the first place, but I did Lord of the Rings. It's all fine. We got here anyway. It just took me a little bit longer. Corey, before we jump into the chapter, why don't you tell me a little bit about your history with Lord of the Rings? How did you get into it? And kind of where did your interests lead you to from there?
Sure. So I first read Tolkien when I was 8. I was 8 years old. When I was 7, my parents read the Chronicles of Narnia with me, and I loved the Chronicles of Narnia. I was a big C.S. Lewis fan, always have been. And I had a cousin. My parents didn't know Tolkien at all, though. We didn't have any Tolkien in the house. And I had a cousin, though, who did know Tolkien, and so he heard that I really liked Narnia, and so he gave me a copy of The Hobbit, I think for Christmas that year, and he was like, if you like the Chronicles of Narnia, you'll like this too. So he gave me The Hobbit, and I did indeed quite like The Hobbit, and got The Lord of the Rings as soon as I could after that, and so I read both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings at the age of 8, and pretty much have been reading and rereading them at least once a year ever since. So, my own, there are a whole many crazy adventures that my own Tolkien reading has led me through. I eventually, of course, majored in English and went to graduate school and got a PhD in medieval literature, which is totally Tolkien's fault, by the way. I'm quite sure that my love of medieval things and my enjoyment of medieval literature was really nurtured by my reading of Tolkien as a kid throughout my childhood. And then when I was, finally when I was teaching, I got a job as a medieval lit instructor and was told to create a whole bunch of new courses for my students. And that was when I had this flashbulb moment when I was like, wait a second, I could teach a class on Tolkien. That would be great. And so I taught a Tolkien class, and that's the thing that then after that led me to start my podcast on Tolkien back in 2009, and then from out of that, starting up a whole online university from scratch kind of grew out of that. So it's so true. Like, you do really have to be careful when you step outside your door, because you never know what's going to happen. So that's where my Tolkien reading has led me. But I still reread The Lord of the Rings every year. I just still have always just loved the primary text very, very much. And that's where I still am. I'm in right now in many partings. I'm just saying goodbye to Treebeard on the way back up from Minas Tirith.
It's a rough one.
Yeah. When in my annual rereading, I'm in the last stages of The Return of the King now. So that's what I still do.
Awesome. That's all amazing. I should also mention that I found you on a Wired video on YouTube.
Right.
Because I was only recently in recent months able to kind of dive into Lord of the Rings on the internet once I had finished the books, because I just spoilers abound for someone who was, 70 years late to the game. And so I found your video on Wired where you're answering all of these questions that Lord of the Rings fans have. And I just loved how approachable you made it, that you explained things very simply. And that's just kind of the vibe I'm trying to go with my podcast, is making Lord of the Rings and Tolkien accessible to people who are like, this seems like a very daunting series and books to dive into, and just making it more, reader friendly. So I appreciate that, because there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that I've experienced and met on the internet who feel they are very superior to others with their opinions. So I'm grateful that you aren't one of those people.
Oh, well, thanks. No, it's always been, for me, Tolkien has always been a way to connect with people, like it's a common ground throughout my life. It's been a common ground, and it's been fun. I mean, it's been, I remember when the Peter Jackson films came out, I'm old enough that I was already an established adult Tolkien reader when the Peter Jackson movies first came out. And I remember like the first generation kind of snobbery, or like impulse to snobbery, to look down on those people who had merely watched the films, or, look down on people who had discovered Tolkien through the films and be like, oh, well, they are not real Tolkien fans. And, that's extremely tiresome. It's and really a very self-defeating way to look at things. I was always really grateful for the Peter Jackson films because it created a much wider community. And that's why I'm similarly really looking forward to the Amazon series, because I assume that, again, there will be more people who will, discover Tolkien either for the first time or essentially for the first time, and sit down and read them for the first time. And having seen now over many years the wonderful fruit that has come of it, to see folks who, because I have a huge respect for casual readers of Tolkien, for like non-scholarly readers of Tolkien. I have learned so much from talking to people over the internet, through my podcast, through my courses and things. I've learned so much from other Tolkien readers that, it's in my mind kind of silly to try to, rigidly maintain lines like that.
Beautifully, wonderfully put. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Now we will jump into the chapter discussion. Oh my God. I'm just so thrilled to be starting this and reading this finally. This is chapter 1, An Unexpected Party, which I did not realize when I was reading Lord of the Rings that the first chapter of Fellowship, A Long Expected Party, is a callback to this.
Yes. It's one of the fun things about doing it in reverse order, that you do get that, like, oh, now I understand, these later references and things. So no, that's definitely fun.
Mm-hmm. It starts off with that very iconic opener line. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Just wonderful. And I'm just gonna, reading this, I didn't know how else to describe it other than it felt like I was reading a classic children's, bedtime story, which is exactly what it was.
Exactly what it was. Yeah. By the way, do you know the story behind the first line?
Yeah, I was actually gonna, in my edition of the book, there's a note from a preface from Christopher Tolkien.
Yes.
Which is just so wonderful to hear, from his point of view, how it all got started. Do you want to go ahead and share how the behind the scenes kind of that opener line?
It's a really fun moment, and fun not only just because as an isolated moment in itself, it's really fun, but because it is extremely typical of how Tolkien's mind and creative process worked. It's just a wonderful little glimpse into what Tolkien's writing was. And of course, the story is he's grading papers, basically he's grading exams. It was even worse than papers. It was like standardized exam essays he was grading. It's like, I can't even imagine anything worse as far as from a grading perspective than that, right? So he's great. And he came upon a blank page in the student exam book that he was reading. And he just takes out his pen and he writes down, in the hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And he had no idea where that came from. He didn't know what a hobbit was. He had to find out, he was like, the next thing was and the next thing I had to find out what hobbits were. I didn't even know. That's the kind of thing that, writing is a voyage of discovery for Tolkien all the way through. It's not that he doesn't do any planning. He plans ahead in waves, but whenever he gets there, things always change. There's so many things in The Lord of the Rings, which not only he didn't see coming when he started. I mean, that's almost everything in The Lord of the Rings he didn't see coming when he started. But that when he comes across them, these things just kind of come out. And then his whole attitude towards it is, well, now I have to find out what that is. That's how the whole Ringwraith thing came about. The entire Ring of Power storyline in the Lord of the Rings came about when he got Frodo out on the road, right? And then this horse started coming up behind him, the sound of hooves, and they ditched off the side of the road because they were thinking it was Gandalf. And the thing is, Tolkien also thought it was Gandalf when he wrote that. Like, he was going to make Gandalf come along. And then for some reason, when he wrote White Horse, he crosses out white and wrote black above it. And then it was like suddenly this black, mysterious, scary figure. And he had no idea who or what this thing was. And he had to figure it out. Like, what is this thing? And what's threatening them? And why is this happening? That's totally Tolkien's method. So the entire concept of The Hobbit, the whole idea of hobbits, the whole idea of the Shire, this was all something that he was just like, okay, I gotta figure this out, I guess. So yeah, it's just such a classic, kind of Tolkien composition moment there.
Mm-hmm. And then it describes the Hobbit hole. It's very cozy and warm. And it says it had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. And it's just so funny to think about that, like, the color of this door is essentially what led us to this series and to The Hobbit, and then later on to Lord of the Rings and this vast world that he created. In the preface, Christopher Tolkien shares, he also remembered that I, then between 4 and 5 years old, was greatly concerned with petty consistency as the story unfolded, and that on one occasion I interrupted, last time you said Bilbo's front door was blue, and you said Thorin had a golden tassel on his hood, but you've just said that Bilbo's front door was green, and the tassel on Thorin's hood was silver. At which point my father muttered, "Damn the boy," and then strode across the room to his desk to make a note.
Yes.
Just so wonderful.
Yeah.
So we have this description of the Hobbit hole and of the Bagginses. Baggins is the name of this Hobbit that lives in this particular hole. It says, this is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. Because we come to find out the Bagginses and Hobbits in general are very respectable. They're very happy with their comfortable, safe lives in the Shire. They don't need to leave and do anything crazy, like go on adventures.
Right. Or almost all, right? There are those tooks who,
those crazy tooks.
They are unpredictable and act in these strange ways. So yeah, it's one of the things that is most clearly established there, isn't it? At the beginning of the chapter, this sense of like the normal, quiet life. And I find it a really, when you think about how as a reader, especially as a child, you're kind of brought in to this world, right? On the one hand, you're immediately confronted with like, this is very different, right? These are hobbits. These are not humans. They're kind of funny little creatures. They live in holes in the ground. So it's like, we're immediately in a fantasy world, right? This is not the real world. And yet it's a lot like our real world, right? Bag End is very comfortable and might look a lot like a lot of things in your house. And it's not like he's in a wild, crazy and adventurous world, right? In fact, right away, the way I've often talked about this is like, in case you might happen to be a reader, or a child who's a little resistant to fantasy and adventures, who might like have a hard time imagining, strange and magical things and, it might kind of prefer quiet, normal life. Well, Bilbo's on your side because he doesn't want anything to do with that stuff either. We get sent off on the adventure there over the course of chapter 1, but of course we get wrapped up in how Bilbo is overwhelmed and sent off and has an adventurer invade his house, right? But the foundation for that is laid in Bilbo's ancestry, right? He's mostly Baggins-ish, mostly, a copy of his respectable father, but, there's something strange in there, right? There's something queer from his took makeup.
That was something I loved in the first couple chapters of Fellowship, was getting all of this like Hobbit drama and the gossip of the different families in the Shire. It's just so fun. And so yes, it mentions that Bilbo's mother was a Took, and it mentions that the Tooks are They were not as respectable as the Baggins, though they were undoubtedly richer.
Undoubtedly richer. There's money in adventuring, apparently.
Yeah,
you know,
and so...
which, of course, Bilbo will find.
Yeah, oh, actually, I should mention it also says, he may have lost the neighbor's respect, but he gained... Well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. So I like this very whimsical,
absolutely,
kind of dry humor of the narrator, which I guess in Fellowship we learned the narrator is technically Bilbo because he's the one that writes The Hobbit.
Yeah, and it's fun when you look at the Lord of the Rings, a lot of the things that people notice is that the tone of the Lord of the Rings changes a lot from the first chapter. You know, by the time you get to chapter 3 and 4, we're in a very different place, right? And it's clear, you know, so on the one hand, you can, like, historically, you can see how that happened because, you know, he wrote The Hobbit and he wrote The Hobbit as a kid's book. And so he wrote it with this, the kind of, you know, dry comedic voice of the narrator. This is very late 19th, early 20th century children's book kind of tone. Like, this is a very common sort of, like, if you think about it, it's a very similar to the kind of voice that you can hear in Alice in Wonderland. Lots of kids' books from this time, The Wind in the Willows, right? There are a lot of kids' books from like that 50-year stretch or so, which have narrators kind of like this. And that's kind of the genre that he's writing in, right? And then he starts off writing a sequel to that, so he's in the same genre, and then it kind of grows and shifts into something else.
Yeah.
But it's especially fun in the like thinking about the sort of fictional frame of the books, right? Because as you say, Bilbo is the author, right? But of course, in The Lord of the Rings, we learn that Frodo actually wrote the majority of The Lord of the Rings itself, right? So I like to think that the narrative voice, that funny kind of whimsical narrative voice, is Bilbo's voice. Right. And he wrote the first few chapters and then Frodo kind of takes it over, and that's why it becomes more serious.
Oh, I like that, because it would make sense that once, because Frodo only, you know, writes their story when he gets back from destroying the ring and everything, and he's been just so touched by darkness, and he's just so depressed living in the Shire in those years when they get home. So that makes sense that, yeah, the writing and the tone and everything in Lord of the Rings would be different because Frodo is writing it.
Frodo's writing.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Exactly. It's so cool how that fits. He was so great at making that, fitting that kind of a frame to the text that was there. Yeah. This is Tolkien's method all the time, by the way. Like, if there was something that didn't quite work, like, again, like the way you'd be like, hey, Tolkien, you know, the tone is kind of uneven. You know, chapter 1 doesn't really sound like chapter 4. Maybe you should fix that. Tolkien wouldn't fix it. Instead, he'd be like, instead of fixing it, I'm going to explain it. Right? I'm going to invent a story that explains why it is that way. And that's so much more fun than it is to just change it.
Yeah, I should also mention that right off the bat, this is so much easier to read than Fellowship of the Ring.
Yes, absolutely.
Just so much easier to read rather than slogging through like page after page of like exposition and not that it's not wonderful, but you know, I make fun of Tolkien a lot for going off for 2 pages of like landscape description.
Absolutely. That's what he is most famous for. Though you can hear a similar kind of thing, like the business about the door, right? The color of the door and the doorknob and the exact center and stuff. The thing about that, like Tolkien was a painter. Actually, kind of first and foremost, I think. I think he thinks and imagines like a painter before. Like, he was painting before he was writing. I mean, he was a better writer than he was a painter. You know, he wasn't a great painter, but he was a good painter. But he loved painting landscape descriptions. So I am like 100% sure that the reason we get all those passages, right? When he's writing, the first thing that happens when he's like imagining a scene or we're going is like, he can see it. He can see it like a painter. And in fact, you can see if you look, if you ever get a chance to look at like his collected paintings, many of the scenes that he does describe in those, he's actually has painted, right? Not all of them by any stretch, but many of them he does. Like you can see a painting and go right to a passage of text and say, like, yeah, this is what he was trying to capture. He's not illustrating, right? He's not illustrating the text. It's the other way around. So yeah, his landscapes are really, really detailed. And it's one of the things that makes so many people fall in love with Middle-earth. It is a real obstacle for a lot of people. I absolutely acknowledge that. It makes it, especially The Lord of the Rings, difficult to read. And he's much lighter on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In The Hobbit.
I should say though that like, of course, without all of these descriptions, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings wouldn't be what it is today, because he is a master of world building because of adding in all these details. Like, there's a whole paragraph about a description of what are hobbits. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, wear no shoes. They have deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner. All of this, like, beautiful descriptive language is just wonderful, masterful world building for this world that we're going to be spending, the next... I haven't even checked how long this book is, 270, 300 pages, whatever, in my edition.
Right.
Yeah, so I believe we were talking about the Tooks and the Bagginses.
And the Bagginses,
And yes, Bilbo does have a little more Took in him. It says he got something a bit queer in his makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had in fact apparently settled down immovably. And I like this idea that you have this very kind of this trope of the unexpected hero. Yes. Which is fitting for an unexpected party.
Right.
This person who is very settled and comfortable in their life and doesn't think that there's anything extraordinary that will ever happen to him. But of course, just goes to show it's never too late to go on an adventure or try something new.
That's right. Ultimately, like, the genre of The Hobbit ultimately is fairy tale. It's a fairy tale. That's what it is. So, and you think about it, most fairy tales start with a normal person, right, going about normal things, who then, like, goes into the wood and meets a fairy, or, comes to the witch's house or whatever. That's a very normal sort of trope. Or maybe even, it's like the king and queen's court, and then the fairy comes to the court, right? And then strange things start happening or whatever. But that idea of, like, a normal frame, and then the real story is when the normal world comes in contact with magic, with this other world.
Mm-hmm. Next, we have an introduction of a familiar character for me. It's Gandalf. And I am so thrilled to get to spend more time with Gandalf the Grey, because Gandalf the White he's a lot more serious. He's not as, funny or whatever. So I'm really excited to get to see more of Gandalf, and especially just in this first chapter of seeing, like, the kind of mischief that he sets up for Bilbo.
Right.
And it honestly had someone ask me a question I did a Q&A episode before this episode to kind of talk about my expectations or predictions for The Hobbit, and someone asked a question that I ended up not answering on the episode, but now it makes sense, which was that it was something along the lines of, do you think Gandalf actually likes hobbits, or does he like torturing them? or something to that effect, which is fun because he does say, actually, I'll wait until we get to that part, but there is a particular line he says that does make me wonder, like, Gandalf, how much of this is you doing all of this for your own entertainment?
Right, exactly.
So it mentions that Gandalf has been known to come into the Shire every now and then. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went in the most extraordinary fashion. And he comes across Bilbo, and Bilbo doesn't recognize Gandalf, and they kind of talk for a bit, and Gandalf mentions that he's here to find someone to join him on an adventure. Mm-hmm. And Bilbo says, "We are plain quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things make you late for dinner." I love that little note. Make you late for dinner.
The complete ignorance of Bilbo about adventures. Yes, Bilbo, they'll make you late for dinner, right? Like, he doesn't even understand really the category of adventure, right? The idea of, I'm going to go off and I'm going to be journeying for an entire year, right? And who knows what's going to be happening. Like, that is so far off his radar screen that, an adventure is like an unexpected thing that happens to you on the way home from the post office, basically. Like, it might make you late for dinner. the extent to which he has no idea of what's going on. It's really fun.
Yeah. And Bilbo I like how Bilbo he's very passive aggressive and yet still polite because he's a hobbit. And he just kind of decides that he's done talking to Gandalf. And so he just stands there smoking for a while. And then it says he had decided that he was not quite his sort and wanted him to go away.
Yes.
And finally he turns to him and says, "Good morning. We don't want any adventures here, thank you," and tells him to go try somewhere else. And Gandalf is finally, I was like, "You're trying to get rid of me."
And exactly as Gandalf says, Bilbo sounds like he's trying to get rid of a salesman. Right.
Yeah.
We don't want any adventures here, thank you.
No, thank you.
No, thank you. Yes.
Gandalf finally says, like, "Do you know who I am? You remember my name. You just might not be putting the name to the face. I'm Gandalf." And this is what sparks Bilbo's memory of all of the adventurous things and mischief that Gandalf has caused in the Shire. He talks about telling tales about dragons and goblins, setting off fireworks, I love this sentence. It says so he's describing these fireworks in great detail. And then the narrator says, "You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe. Also that he was very fond of flowers."
Yes.
So I love this first little glimpse that like Bilbo he wants to kind of act and pretend like the fireworks and everything are above him, or he's above it, I guess.
Right.
But he can't help but be drawn into that excitement.
Exactly. Yeah. One thing I would point out, and so I won't reveal anything from later in the book, but it's going to be a little theme, and we'll come back to it here before the end of chapter 1, or near the end of chapter 1. But it's going to be a theme throughout the book, which is the question of identity, and especially of Bilbo's identity. The way that Gandalf says that, yes, you do know my names, but you don't remember that I belong to it. Right. So that question of like the connection between a person and the person's name. Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, Bilbo is going to get a name from Gandalf in the end of chapter 1. Right. Burglar is the name. He's going to be called a burglar. If I say he's a burglar, then a burglar he is. Gandalf is going to say later on in the chapter. And that question of like the link between, Bilbo doesn't think that he belongs to that name. And to what extent does he belong to it? And who is he? What is he? He's, Bilbo Baggins, but we've already talked about like he's both Took and Baggins. So like, which one is he? Is he Mr. Baggins or is he Mr. Took? And can those two things live together? And how do they live together? And what does that look like right now? So far, he's just been all Baggins, and the Took side of him has just been kind of suppressed or even repressed, perhaps, right? But it's going to come out, and we see it. Even notice in that passage about him not being so prosy as he liked to believe. See, like he has ideas about himself, his own identity, and who he is, but he's not entirely right about that, right? There are things about himself that he doesn't even really yet understand or confront. All of these things are things that are going to be really a big part of the developing story of Bilbo over the course of The Hobbit. Mm-hmm.
Now Gandalf says like, "Okay, well now I will send you on this adventure like you asked for." And Bilbo's like, "I haven't asked for anything." Gandalf says, "In fact, I will go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me." This is what I was kind of referring to earlier. "Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too, very likely, if you ever get over it."
If you ever get over it is such a funny line. Yeah. Which of course means both like if you ever recover from the experience, but also literally means if you survive.
Yeah.
Like,
if you make it back.
If you make it back,
there might be something in it for you.
Exactly. I forgot one thing I was going to add before. Another one of those wonderful Tolkien discovery moments. That line when he said, but he gained, well, you'll see if you think he gained anything in the end, right? Mm-hmm. Earlier on. When Tolkien wrote that, he himself had no idea how Bilbo's story was going to end. Like, he didn't know. He didn't know. Like, I always assumed that he wrote that in at the end, like after he'd written the book, right? As a kind of teaser.
Right. Uh-huh.
But he himself was in fact perfectly ignorant of what Bilbo would gain when he
This
wrote
is
that.
so funny to hear and learn about Tolkien, because I always imagined him, and I think a lot of people imagine him too, as this guy like locking himself in his office, sitting in the dark, and his hair standing on end, and there are like red strings everywhere as he's trying to make everything connect. So I love this idea of him like he's going on this adventure as well. He is
He absolutely
discovering
is.
things as we're discovering them.
Exactly. And instead of somebody who had everything like worked out in advance and like has, you know, the whole picture in his head, instead he's somebody like what he's really good at is like riddles. Like he's good at answering the questions like, so what is a hobbit anyway? You know, and like, who is that person on the black horse riding up, you know, the road behind Frodo? And, you know, like when he asks himself these questions, he comes to really good answers to these questions, and he's able to put things together really, really well. But that's really the whole exercise for him, is discovering the story and figuring it out and putting it together.
Yeah, that's just so wonderful. Bilbo sends Gandalf on his way, but still invites him to tea the next afternoon. When he's inside his house finally, he's like, why did I ask him to tea? That was the dumbest thing in the world. I don't want to see any more of this guy.
Thwarted by his own politeness.
Yes. And Gandalf is outside, and he's just kind of there laughing at himself. And then he makes a mark on Bilbo's door and leaves. So the next day, Bilbo hears a knock on the door. And he's like, oh, shoot, that's right. Gandalf, I invited him to tea. Goes to answer the door. Except it's not Gandalf. It's a dwarf. And the dwarf names it. Okay, this is where I'm already gonna give up on keeping all of the names straight.
Yeah, it's complicated. And honestly, they're meant to be funny. I mean, he made up almost none of these names. All these names are straight out of Old Norse dwarf poetry lists.
You're kidding.
Like, oh, no, it's all there. Yeah. But they're design. I mean, he threw them together, I think, comically. Like, it's supposed to be kind of confusing. Yeah.
It's very like classic fairy tale-esque, because they all rhyme, which we'll see in a bit. They all rhyme. So anyway, yes, this dwarf comes and knocks on the door and says he is Dwalin. Is that, am I saying
Dwalin,
that correctly?
yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
In addition to reading it, I also listened to the audiobook chapter read by Rob Inglis.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Listeners, I will leave a link to that in the description. I've found a free audiobook online if you want to listen to that.
There's also the recent Andy Serkis recording of The Hobbit.
What? I didn't know about that.
Just released last year. Yeah. He did a full unabridged recording of The Hobbit.
Oh, that's wonderful. Of course, I can only think of it. I can only imagine it as if he's doing it in the Gollum voice, but that's not what he would do. But
yeah, it might be like I was actually a little unsure how Andy Serkis's Gollum voice would work in The Hobbit, but it was good. It was good.
Yeah, that's so funny, because I don't think I even know what Andy Serkis's real voice sounds like.
It's especially, of course, his voices and
he's just so talented.
Are very, very good. Yeah.
Yeah. So this dwarf Dwalin comes, and it was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. And so he walks in, welcomes himself, hangs his hood up. Bilbo sets out some tea and cakes for him, and then there is another knock on the door, and this continues to happen. These dwarves come in and knock on the door. The next door is Balan, which I'm so sad to make the connection that it's the same Balan that we find out dies in Moria in Fellowship of the Ring. So like, that's sad to know that I know what happens to him and it's not a good ending.
Right. No, it's not. But, you know, he did have a very full and exciting career, Balan did. He's quite old. He's the second oldest member of the dwarf party here.
Okay.
Thorin's the oldest, but
I
Balan
guess that makes me feel better.
Oh yeah, no, and Balan did almost everything. I mean, like Balan was involved in almost every major story of like, you know, the dwarves have had going. You know, he's been from the attack of the dragon, as we're going to learn here in a little bit. You know, he was there with Thorin, on that day when the dragon attacked, all the way up through, their entire adventure, and then, reclaiming Moria afterwards. Balan has an amazing career, but it doesn't end super well.
Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah. So as he lets Balan in, it says he liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. I just love
Yes.
that. Again, the kind of dry wit.
Absolutely.
Of Bilbo. So great. Balan asks for beer, and Bilbo's like, I guess I'll go get you beer. He's just so confused about what's happening. Dwarves keep knocking on the door, and every time he goes, he's like, this surely must be Gandalf at this point. Next is Keely and Feely, and they are younger dwarves. Mm-hmm. And they all sit down and they talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous.
That's right.
And then our next group of people at the door is Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin.
That's right.
I should mention, they all have very colorful descriptions, which is definitely different than how I'm picturing. I haven't seen the Hobbit movies, but I have seen, Gimli from Lord of the Rings. So I'm picturing them as, they have, normal colored hair and they're in brown tones and stuff. So hearing these very colorful descriptions of they have blue beards and yellow beards. And
this is exactly, again, we're in, like, this is a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the bright colors and there's a lot of ways in which the Hobbit it's not really designed to be, sort of pictured like that. It doesn't have that kind of, it's not shooting for that kind of realism,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just meant to be, it's just fun and fantastical, I guess. The next knock on the door, Bilbo sits down in the hallway first and just puts his head in his hands. And that just makes me laugh, just imagining him just sitting there being like, what is going on? What have I gotten into? What is happening? What is happening?
Yes.
And then when he lets them in, the dwarves all come tumbling in. It is Bifur, Bofer, Bomber, and Thorin. And then I believe at last, finally, Gandalf makes an appearance.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, are we going to get an explanation finally to what's happening? The answer is no, because then everyone puts in an order for just all sorts of foods. There's raspberry and jam, apple tarts, mince pies, pork pie, cakes, ale, coffee. Mm-hmm. And of course, Bilbo, being a hobbit, isn't going to be rude to them. And he runs around to, meet every request. And then it says he was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house.
Right. He was trying to avoid adventure, but this is, there's almost the sense here, right? Especially with like that discussion about the depredations of dragons and stuff like that. It's like he's there holding his head in his hands because he's now beginning to understand what like the word adventure means, really.
Yeah, and he's like, I don't know if I want to go fight dragons. Like, I was thinking more an adventure down to the lake in Tookland. 5 miles from here.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the adventure I want. And after they all finish eating, Bilbo goes to pick it all, to clean everything up. The dwarves are like, no, we can do it. And Bilbo is fussing at them, saying like, please be careful. And then the dwarves proceed to mock him in song. And make fun of him and say, chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. So just poor Bilbo. He's had these people, he has no idea who they are. They barge into his house. They demand all his food and drinks. They are talking about all these adventurous things that he has no idea what they are, what they mean. And then now they're mocking him about, please be careful with all of my cutlery and my plates and everything. It's the least you can do, I think, for barging in here uninvited.
That's right. And you'll notice how they both are making fun of him, right? They're teasing him. him for being as upset as he is. And yet, of course, they're not actually doing any of those terrible things. You know, they're not actually
they're not that
rude.
Mean, yeah.
No, they're not actually rude or mean. They're just teasing him, right? They can see, they find it funny how upset he is. But of course, in fact, they do quite the opposite, right? They're very quick and efficient in putting all the dishes away and cleaning up and everything.
So after dinner, they have some music. Everyone has brought an instrument of some kind. They all sit around and sing and play, and they start singing a song that I recognize from sea shanty TikTok, actually. I recognize this song because it was something that they looked like dwarves. It was these big burly dudes who are baritones, and they started a video chain adding in these beautiful harmonies to Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold.
Right.
So I recognize this song from that video that I think came out of a couple of weeks ago. Sea shanties was the trend on TikTok. So, so they sing this song that, I'll be honest, I skimmed through. I've never been a big fan of reading the songs. Because I'm usually like, the songs have nothing to do with the plot. And then, of course, we find out later, and Thorin kind of makes fun of Bilbo of like, you didn't listen, did you? And I was like, oh, Thorin knows that I didn't exactly read all the way through the song.
Exactly. So this has been one of my like campaigns for many years, is to try to encourage people to read the songs, because although it is generally true that they don't much further the plot, like, you're not going to, fail to understand the story if you skip them. But they do a very great deal of work, especially in helping to introduce characters, and in particular, like atmospheres and things. And in The Hobbit in particular, the reason I would argue that it's very important to read the songs, we learn that's where he does a lot of his world building, basically. Like, what are dwarves like? What are goblins like? What are elves like? What all of these questions get answered first and foremost in the songs, like much more clearly in the songs than anywhere else. So again, it's true that you don't lose plot if you skip the songs, but there's a great deal that is going on in the songs that really give us a lot that we might not have noticed or known otherwise, that he never really tells us otherwise. Sometimes he'll give us the same thing in prose afterwards, like the passage you were talking about where Bilbo says, I want it all fair and square. Yeah, I want it in prose too, in addition to the song. But that doesn't always happen, right? And it's not that it's always crucially important, but sometimes ideas and themes are pointed to in those songs, which, we might miss or not think about much if they weren't brought up in the songs, but often it's more about like characters and the categories of characters and how they're thinking and what they're like. He does a lot of world building in the song. So
yeah, I should mention another time this bit me in the butt was when I made fun of in Fellowship when Aragorn is he's trying to like keep the hobbits entertained or whatever, basically, and he starts singing and telling the tale of Luthien, Beren and Luthien. And I was like, I'm sure this doesn't matter. And then come to find out later, that's basically one of the only times Tolkien hints at Aragorn and Arwen's relationship. I was like, I'm sure this song means nothing. And then turns out it actually had a great deal to do with Aragorn's character. Exactly. So yeah, I guess I will be paying more attention to the songs in the future. Yes.
Well, one, if I could be excused a plug here, my book on The Hobbit, exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, I spend a lot of time looking at the poems, because I know that a lot of people don't read the poems carefully or have a hard time figuring out like how to make anything of the poems and stuff. So I spend a fair bit of time looking at each one of the poems and kind of talking about how it works and what's going on in there. So it's potentially a resource for folks who want to think more about the poems but aren't like super comfortable with it.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. And so they finish the song and it says, as they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him. A fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside him and he wished to go and see the great mountains and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls and explore the caves and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. And so at this point, I'm like, all right, Gandalf, what kind of mischief have you started causing? What are you doing here?
Mm-hmm. And it's the effect of song on Bilbo, right? As he is finding himself just transported in his own mind and imagination here.
Yeah. And so they all sit around to talk. Then the dwarves start talking about what they all came there to talk about. Of course, we don't know what that is yet because so Thorin stands up and starts talking. It mentions several times throughout the chapter that he's a very important dwarf. And it says, if he had been allowed, he probably would have gone on like this until he was out of breath without telling anyone there anything that was not known already. Which was kind of how I was feeling at that point too, because he's just talking about like, we're going to go on this journey that we might not return from. The people who are new here or are young, like Keely and Philly, might not know the exact situation. And he's just taking forever to get to the point, kind of a little bit intish almost. And so at this point, I'm building up with as much frustration as Bilbo is. And then Bilbo just has like a panic attack. Right. Yep. He has some kind of a fit and just starts screaming. He says, he kept on calling out struck by lightning, over and over again. And so they all, I don't know why this made me laugh, but they just pick him up and bring him to the other room and drop him on the couch. Like, well, we dealt with that. Okay, on with, what we're here to do. Gandalf describes him as an excitable little fellow. Then we have this like very random detail that made me laugh a lot, but it's just very random about the old Took's great-grand uncle Bull Roarer. And he was kind of the last... He had a like big grand old adventure, and he charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields and knocked their king's Golfimble's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole. And in this way, the battle was won and the game of golf invented at the same moment. Yeah. That was just so random, and it made me laugh, and I don't know, just very funny and weird at the same time. Absolutely. And so then finally Bilbo kind of wakes up and he goes back over to the room and hears Gloin, who I should mention, of course we know Gloin is Gimli's father, and he is talking about Bilbo and is saying like, I don't know like what I was expecting when I got here, but it's not that kid in there who stood there bobbing and puffing on the mat. So they're all very doubtful of him as a burglar. And Bilbo takes great offense to this. And he's like, now wait a minute. Hang on, I may not know what you're talking about, but can you at least let me in on what's going on if you're going to insult me? Gloin says that they came there because there was a mark on the door that means a burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, and reasonable reward. So we learned this is the mark that Gandalf put on the door the other day. Which is why he was laughing when he wrote it, remember? Like he wrote it and was laughing quietly to himself because he knows how funny burglar looking for plenty of excitement. Yeah, I mean, that's hilarious when applied to Bilbo. And Gandalf knows it's hilarious. Yeah. It does almost, in retrospect, it almost just looks like a practical joke on Gandalf's part. Yeah. Right? He's going to get serious about it in a minute. But in retrospect, it really did seem like it could have been just a practical joke. Yeah. And they say that you can also interpret burglar as expert treasure hunter, if that's what you'd prefer, if that makes it sound nicer to you. Right. And so finally, it says, Gandalf told us there was a man of the sort in these parts looking for a job at once, and he had arranged for a meeting here this Wednesday tea time. So finally, some of the pieces are coming together, like, okay, Gandalf put all of this together. What's he doing? What's he up to? And he defends Bilbo, and he says, there's a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. I love that line because it's also, I think a lot of us can find that applicable to ourselves in some situations.
Absolutely.
So finally, they start getting into some of the business of this meeting, and Gandalf gives Thorin his grandfather's map. His grandfather, Thror. It is a plan of the mountain. I'm assuming they mean the Misty Mountain.
Oh, no, Thror and the mountain. No, that's the
Or is that
the
a different
mountain.
set of mountain?
Well, there's just the mountain, the Lonely Mountain.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Okay. Got it. They're looking at this map and they see that there is a hidden passage marked on it. And they note that it's small, 5 feet high, the door, and 3 may walk abreast. And Bilbo's like, oh, that seems pretty big to me. Which I'm wondering is that, so that's, I mean, of course, I'm sure I will learn more about why exactly Gandalf sought out Bilbo for this adventure. I'm sure I will learn more about that as this book goes on. But it just makes me wonder, like, so is the reason they're coming to get a hobbit because they need someone small who can sneak around into the mountain? Like, why exactly did Gandalf seek out Bilbo specifically if Bilbo doesn't even recognize Gandalf? So clearly they're not like great friends, that Gandalf knows that Bilbo has this tookish quality of him that makes him want to go on this adventure. So I will be interested to see in the coming, chapters, like, why exactly Bilbo? Why Bilbo? So yeah, they just keep talking about this door and there's a key and talking about trying to get inside the mountain and the burglar. And finally, Bilbo says, "First, I should like to know a bit more about things," said he, feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far still tookishly determined to go on with things. So I love that, again, the took in him is fighting to come out. Because at this point, he's like, you're talking about a dragon. You're talking about stealing things. I think I deserve to know a little bit more about what's going on. And this is when Thorin says, like, haven't you been listening to our song? And that's when I was like, oh, whoops. Sorry, Thorin.
That's right.
Then Thorin explains, gives a little history lesson that his grandfather started mining in this mountain and discovered started building up a lot of wealth for the dwarves, and they started working with the men nearby, and they started building up a very reputable life for themselves in this town of Dale. But that could only last for so long, this wealth and all these treasures and everything that they're getting, because that's when the dragon came. Dragons steal gold and jewels, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. They talk about this attack that Smaug,
yeah.
Smaug, right. Okay, great.
Yep.
That Smaug did on the mountain, and Thorin says that he was an adventurous lad at this time, so he was not at the mountain, he was out with some other dwarves, and so he saw what happened, and the dragon attacked the mountain, killed everyone inside, took the treasure, and now they want to get it back. Says, "We have never forgotten our stolen treasure. We still mean to get it back and to bring our curses home to Smaug if we can." And so that's the gist of what's happening. And I would like to say I was kind of sort of on par sort of with my prediction for it. People were asking me like, so what do you think The Hobbit is about? And I just kind of spitballing said, like, I know Gandalf shows up at some point and tells Bilbo to go on an adventure. And I said something like, I think they're gonna go on a treasure hunt. So I wasn't too far off.
No, yeah, treasure hunt is exactly it. In fact, that's not a spoiler. In chapter 4, that exact phrase is going to be used. One of the dwarves is going to talk about bringing a hobbit along on a treasure hunt. So that's exactly it.
There we go. All right. Then they start talking about the plan and what they're going to do and this map. And that's when Thorin's like, how exactly did you get this map, Gandalf? And Gandalf mentions that he met his grandfather. He had been, I think, captured by a necromancer. A prisoner in the dungeons of the Necromancer.
That's right.
And then Thorin says, whatever were you doing there? And just, this is such a classic Gandalf thing from the Gandalf I know. He says, never you mind, I was finding things out as usual. Just keeping it vague and just not answering the question. So I'm like, yeah, Gandalf, what were you doing there? If I know anything about Gandalf, We'll find out later what he was doing there. But of course, that's also the Lord of the Rings part of my mind, which is a much more complex story than The Hobbit. So we might not find out at all. Who knows?
I mean, yeah, we do sort of find out in The Lord of the Rings what he was doing there, right? You know, that's when he discovered that the Necromancer was actually Sauron and all that stuff. Like that's what he was. And while he's there, he finds Thran.
I clearly forgot that part then.
No, he mentions it, he mentions it in the Council of Elrond and a couple other places, but it's
that would be why I don't remember it, because the Council of Elrond is a hefty chapter and so much happens there. So
yeah, it's very true.
So they decide that they're going to set off in the morning. Bilbo says, how about, we all go to bed and get an early start. I will give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. So he takes all of their breakfast orders.
Yep.
They're all very specific orders. It says, after all the others had ordered their breakfast without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much. So they go to bed, and Bilbo can hear Thorin in the next room humming and singing to himself, far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to find our long forgotten gold. And Bilbo goes to bed, and he's very determined that he is not going to get up early in the morning to make any of their breakfasts.
That's right.
And that is how the chapter ends. Is there anything that we glossed over or didn't mention or bring up that you wanted to go back to?
I would just draw attention again to Gandalf's talking about Bilbo. Like I said, it does sound like it started for Gandalf almost like a practical joke, right? Like he didn't really have a clear plan for how he was going, why he was going to invite Bilbo and connect Bilbo into this adventure, and obviously found the idea of it funny, obviously found what he wrote on his door funny. But when it comes to it, right, when the dwarves are dissing on him and not believing in Bilbo, Gandalf doubles down on it. Right? I say he is a burglar, and a burglar, if I say he is a burglar, then a burglar he is or will be when the time comes. There isn't any sense at the beginning of the chapter like Gandalf, has some kind of like foresight upon him, it is destined that I should meet Bilbo Baggins smoking outside of his door. It doesn't sound like that at all. But then when we get to that point, now all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is happening, right? This is exactly what's supposed to happen. Like he himself is only just realizing that it's actually the right thing. It's actually the best thing to do.
Yeah. And so I'm interested to see, obviously, since I know that, we have the whole book after this chapter, I know that Bilbo does indeed go with them.
Yep.
So I will be interested to see what happens in the next chapter that makes Bilbo go, because right now he's in the mindset of like, I'm not going with them. I'm not even going to make them breakfast. So right. I'll be interested to see what happens to get him going with them. Well, that will bring us to the end of this episode. Corey, thank you so much for joining me. What would you like to plug and share with our audience? And where can they find you on the internet if you have any social media or anything like that?
Absolutely. So people can find me. The social media on which I am most active is Twitter. I'm at Tolkien Prof on Twitter. But people can mostly find me at Signum University, which is the university that I founded, where we have an awesome Tolkien studies program, master's degree program, and lots of open public programming that I do every week on Tolkien. And you can find the recordings. There's like hundreds and hundreds of hours of my content publicly available on our YouTube channel. So if you go to the Signum University, SIGNUM YouTube page, you can find lots of stuff there, including discussions of each volume of the Lord of the Rings. And I've been discussing my way through the History of Middle-earth books that Christopher Tolkien published for several years now. We're through volume 10 there. Gosh. So there's lots of stuff. And then, of course, people can join me for my Exploring the Lord of the Rings weekly discussion, where I'm discussing my way through the Lord of the Rings sentence by sentence, in fact.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, we just did session number 174, I think, this past week. Each session is about an hour and a half. We just finished 174, and we're about 2/3 of the way through the Council of Elrond.
Oh, wow.
We've been discussing the Council of Elrond since December of 2019, I think. So it's been a while.
Wow, that's madness. I applaud you for that effort.
I think it's the most in-depth book discussion that's happened in the modern world, actually.
I'll say, yeah. I've had on the podcast, hosts of the podcast Lord of the Rings Minute, where they analyze the Lord of the Rings movies minute by minute. And I thought that was crazy. So going through the book sentence by sentence, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, we started in January of 2017, and we're projecting to finish The Return of the King by somewhere around 2035, I think. So.
Well, hopefully the pandemic will be over by then. So
Hopefully it will.
That's What I'm Talking About is a proud member of WBNE. You can learn more about the network by going to WBNE.org, where you will find all of our shows like Sincerely Us.
Dear listener, today's going to be a good day, and here's why.
Because today we have found your new favorite podcast.
Do you like all things musical theater?
Or do you just like Hamilton?
Then Sincerely Us is perfect for you.
We take deep dives into modern musicals and teach you all that you need to know.
From props and sets
to playwrights and composers,
we will get you caught up on all things Broadway.
We are Becca and Eni, two best friends,
here to teach you all about the shows that we love.
Sincerely Us, a podcast for the casual musical theater fan.
Join us every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts and on WBNE.org.
The cover art is by Graphite, aka Vaishon Brandon. You can support him on Instagram at graphite.vmb. You can get merch for That's What I'm Talking About, like stickers, t-shirts, sweatshirts, by going to tpublic.com/user/talkingaboutpod or following the link in the description. You can find the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at talkingaboutpod, as well as join the Facebook group, which is linked in the description. You can find me on Twitter at MCWattsUp and Instagram at MCTurnedDownForWhat. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/talkingaboutpod, where you will find all of the different tiers and perks, like the sponsor tier, and this week's sponsor is Christina. Christina, thank you so much for your support of That's What I'm Talking About. I love having a restricted section buddy supporting me in this Tolkien endeavor, so thank you so much. And as always, if you like what you're listening to, please rate and review. I'm actually really close to 100 ratings on iTunes, so that's exciting, and help me get closer to that by rating and reviewing. Awesome. Well, do you have any parting words for the audience?
I think this is a wonderful opportunity it's really fun to actually talk with somebody who doesn't know what's going to happen in the rest of The Hobbit. That's really fun. Even when even like back years ago when I was teaching this in undergraduate classes, I didn't often have that experience. So it's really fun to kind of share and listen to people's reactions through. So just, I would just say enjoy and, give the poems a try. Give the poems a try. It's worth it. It's totally worth it.
And that's what I'm talking about.